Welcome to the Ranting Soccer Dad podcast for May 18th, 2018. Yes, 5/18/18. And no, you are not imagining things. I have done 2 podcasts this week because regular schedules are for... I don't know who regular schedules are for, but not for me, apparently. I'm your host, Bo Dewar. My guest today is Dennis Crowley, who has started a club called the Kingston Stockade in the NPSL. You may have heard of them because they do some interesting things. With the way they market themselves and their broadcasting, and the fact that Crowley has taken what he calls an open source approach to this, which is that if you follow him on Medium, and of course you follow him on Twitter, and then you'll know when he's on Medium. In fact, we should mention we didn't get around to mentioning his Twitter ID. Is it Twitter ID? Twitter handle? Twitter username? Anyway, he was a fairly early adopter, so he is Dens, D-E-N-S. He's a tech guy, founded Foursquare. So follow him on Twitter at Dens, D-E-N-S, and you'll get the latest on the Stockade and everything else that's going on in the NPSL and so forth. And I found this to be both an encouraging discussion and a frustrating one. It's encouraging in the sense that I think Dennis and several other people have interesting ideas for how to make the lower divisions more interesting, first of all, and then to perhaps open things up to make it a very different American pro soccer landscape, and one that doesn't necessarily trample what's already been built. You know, there's nothing in what he has never suggested anything akin to, blowing everything up and denigrating the investments of the people who happen to come before him. He just has some interesting ways of opening things up that I think merit a lot of discussion. And so we have a good discussion on several of those issues, several of those ideas. What's frustrating, and it comes out in this interview, is that it's difficult to get all of the stakeholders in the same room or on the same conference call, let alone on the same page. To really have a discussion about moving forward, you have to have people from U.S. soccer who are willing to start talking about the pro league standards and perhaps some other support for these initiatives that people are putting together in the lower divisions. And not it's a two-way street. It's not just that U.S. Soccer needs to come in and listen to all these people. U.S. Soccer also needs to come in and say, look, we need to have some standards in place because we've been through all these cycles of everyone saying, hey, I want to own a soccer team, and then 5 years later they don't want to own a soccer team anymore, and you have a bunch of dead teams. We don't want that anymore. So there's merit to having standards. I think Dennis and a lot of other people make a fair number of valid criticisms about how those standards could be changed. So you have to have a discussion. Right now, it's not even a discussion. It's just a conversation is taking place in one area, and then we don't know if the conversation is taking place elsewhere. Now, one, chilling factor on that is that there are lawsuits involving the pro league standards, and so that might not be the best time to have a conversation about them. But again, why are these lawsuits going on? Why is everyone suing each other? There's an interesting piece coming out. Well, I'm not going to spoil that just now, but let's just say watch The Guardian, because I have a few things to say about all that. But this discussion, again, was frustrating because we couldn't get people in the same room. And this conversation took place just a couple of hours after the news came out that Peter Wilt is no longer involved with NISA, the project to build a third division in this country that would be a link between the fourth and the second tiers. And I think that's upsetting. And we've mentioned before, why wasn't Peter at the Chattanooga summit where we were going to talk about all of this? That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Here you have someone who has experience, who is ideologically aligned with you. I mean, Peter threw his weight behind Eric Winalda as much as anyone else did, perhaps even more so. And why is he not part of these discussions? Why is it so difficult to get NISA and NPSL and UPSL to work together? Now, as Dennis points out, a lot of clubs in these different leagues don't all have the same mission. And look, whatever happens down the road, we'll probably have, summer league soccer, primarily for college players. That's still going to be there. It may be part of a pyramid. It may not be. You may have some owners who try out summer league play for a while and then decide, hey, I want to do something different, something more expansive. You may not. You may just say, hey, I'm perfectly happy doing what I'm doing right now. And one of the nice things that Dennis talks about is that he is giving clubs the choice. He's not going to force anyone to go up a ladder or a pyramid or whatever, so that you don't have to win your summer league. Oh, well, then now you have to join a league that plays fall through spring and so forth. So Dennis really is sort of at the vanguard of people who want to see promotion relegation, but are fairly realistic about it and are willing to think about it in creative ways. So that's the fun part about it. And again, the frustrating part, you can have a separate UPSL, a separate NPSL, separate NISA, separate USL, but it's discouraging to see that they're just not able to talk. I don't know a solution to that. And look, the accusations that sometimes spring up are that everything in the promotion relegation discussion, everything in the open system, everything about lower divisions, oh, well, it's your opinion. Oh, it's opinion. It's opinion. Or, you're backing so-and-so. I think most people just want to see some progress. And they don't really care how it's done, who does it. They just want to see progress. And when we see things that look like obvious dead ends, and I think having Rocco Camiso put all his money into propping up the brand name NASL is a dead end. I could be wrong, or as Don Henley once sang, I could be wrong, but I'm not. I would strongly doubt that I'm wrong. Or I put it this way: I think there are better ways to spend that money, and I think going to having a summit where you have Camiso in a room with all these people, fine. Hey, let's figure out what we're going to do with all this. We have the resources, we have the ideas. What can we do? And we're just not quite there yet. But if it makes you feel any better, here's a good conversation where you can listen to Dennis Crowley talk about these ideas. And I asked him to flesh out a few things, and I asked him a couple of, I don't want to say tough questions. That's really in the eye of the beholder. But they're questions that go a little bit deeper, that are at least challenging, I would think, to see where we can go practically. On a practical level, where can we go? How can we take all this ideology and make it practical? How can we make actual progress happening? I think Dennis has potential to do that. So here's a conversation. Kingston Stockade's Dennis Crowley. My guest today is Dennis Crowley, who has come into soccer and embarked on a very interesting experiment and let all of us in on the fun. So can you describe a little bit about what prompted you to start the Kingston Stockade and to make it, as I believe you put it, open source?
Yeah, a couple years ago, the summer of 2015, that we had this idea to, hey, let's try to start a club from scratch, and it was loosely inspired by seeing the New York Cosmos best of the NYCFC in the Open Cup match in the summer of 2015. That's kind of where we got this idea, and kind of we started doing a bunch of research on lower division soccer and the lower leagues in general. And I was kind of shocked that there wasn't more just more written about, okay, if you want to do this, this is how you do it, and this is how to evaluate it, and this is how much it costs, and this is how it works. And, in our journey to want to start a club and put it up here in the Hudson Valley, we decided that, okay, if we're going to do this, like, let's do it in a way that other people can learn from it, and other people can draft on the backs of what we've done. So that's why we've tried to be very transparent in, every decision we make, every dollar we spend, everything that worked and then everything that didn't work. And the results so far have been great. We've heard of a handful of clubs, across the country and even, outside the U.S. that are using kind of our numbers or some of the things that we've discovered along the way to help them get started.
And what's interesting about it is that the data sometimes seem to go, not necessarily in line with what a lot of observers seem to want it to go. I mean, you've pointed out that it would be fairly difficult for a team based in Kingston, or club based in Kingston, to be under these circumstances, to be a professional club at all. And even in the long run, if you open up the pyramid and had all sorts of investment, to be a first division club. So with Kingston, what would be the sum of your ambitions?
What would be some of the? I couldn't hear you the last word.
What would be the sum of your ambitions just with Kingston? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, initially it was about just starting a club from scratch, and we always refer to it as a professional club. Like, what does it take to get a professional club off the ground? Again, being inspired by the Cosmos, who were brought back from the dead by really an investment group. I want to say it was in like the early 2000s, mid 2000s. And so, like, we started off as we are now. We're an amateur league, and we're playing in a short season, the NPSL. And we're really trying to collect enough data to show, like, what do you need to do, and how much money do you need to make, and how much does it cost, and how much can you offset it with merchandise or tickets or sponsorships, in order to get to the point where you can actually take a team pro and play a long season. And so, it's not that it's impossible to do. It's just like you gotta figure out how to do it. And I think when people generally look at these things, they're like, oh, well, I'm going to start it in a huge market. I'll put something in, New York or Boston or Atlanta or wherever. It's a market with millions of fans. Like up here in Kingston, the town is 20,000 people, and there's a lot of people that are interested in the sport. There's a lot of fans of clubs from around the world up here. A lot of people are playing. There's a lot of talent up here. It's like even in a town of 20,000 and in a county of call it 190,000. Would we be able to get enough people together enough times during the season in the summer to offset the cost of having a professional team? Like right now, it works as an amateur team, and it works as an amateur team playing a short season. It would probably work as an amateur team playing a long season. If we could find amateur players that could commit to playing the long season. But in order to get it to the point where we'd have professional players, like we did the math this season, and our attendance isn't there yet. And we probably need to get around 2,000, 2,200 fans a game before we can start generating the type of revenue that we need to have a paid payroll.
And we should plug this. I usually say a lot of plugs for the end, but we should point out that this is on your Medium page, right? That's your primary distribution. And I did read your most recent posts, or at least I didn't go all the way into the weeds, I confess, but I did read the overviews and so forth, and saw that it's starkly realistic, and it is an interesting experiment. I don't know of anyone who has done anything like that before. Now, there are, of course, we've seen in some cases cycles of people who've tried this at different levels, and what I think back to is the 1990s when we had an explosion of lower division teams, similar to what we're seeing now. What was then called the USISL, which is now broken into what we call the USL and the PDL. Mm-hmm. At one point had, I think, 78 teams in one division. I mean, it's regionally broken out, but it was 78 teams on the same tier, and then they broke into tiers and even tried to do a little bit of promotion and relegation. What happened was, of course, most of those clubs are gone now. There are a few exceptions that you bump into in the Open Cup, Charleston Battery and Richmond Kickers, which I talked about in the last podcast. They're actually a youth club that just happens to have a pro team. Yeah. And but most of them went by the wayside, and the ones that survived mostly were the ones that went into the PDL. Have you been able to draw upon any of that experience? I know it's not published. I mean, those medium, of course, didn't exist at those days. Have you been able to contact any of the people who were involved in those days and get any lessons from what they've been through?
I haven't. To be honest, we just kind of started doing our own thing and trying to solve our own puzzle, right? I'm pretty close with a bunch of the teams in our league in the NPSL to try to figure out, okay, where are they for cost and,
right.
What do their numbers look like and how close to break even or are they better than break even? So I'm trying to get a sense of that.
And some of them have been around for a good while.
What's that?
Some of the NPSL clubs have been around for a good while as well.
Oh yeah, and if you figure out a way to stay around for a while, I mean, you figured it out. But there's a couple different business models. Like some of the business models are, hey, we have a youth team, or we have a whole bunch of youth team. We run a whole bunch of youth camps and clinics, and then the NPSL team is the thing that differentiates us from different youth teams in the area. That's not our model. Our model is like, okay, let's pay for this with the first team, with the the merchandise sales and the sponsorship and the season tickets and game day tickets. And so there's a number of different models that the teams use to do this. I think that there is a form of soccer that's close to kind of the farm system that you see in baseball, where the teams have an affiliation, or lower level or minor league teams have an affiliation with the major league team, and there might be some financial some of the financial burden might be handled by the team with the better finances in that situation. And I think it's a little bit of what some of the soccer seems to the soccer ecosystem seems to shape up to look like. PDL organizations have an affiliation with some MLS sides. The same thing you're seeing with the USL. And I think the real opportunity, the really interesting thing is like, how do you start all these independent clubs? There's very few clubs in the NPSL, if any, that have any affiliation with anything happening on the NLS or the USL or the PDL side. Everyone's kind of doing their own independent thing. And I think that's where it really gets interesting, right? Like if you had a country that was full of, 1,000 independent clubs, each of them drawing an audience of, call it a couple hundred fans, maybe a couple thousand fans in a few instances. Like there's really that's a product that touches a lot of people across a lot of different parts of the U.S. And that's something that doesn't really exist in the U.S. right now.
Right, and it's and we do have thousands of youth clubs, but most of them don't start professional teams. A few of them do, but the majority of them don't. Even some. I mean, it's a frustration in my area where I think, why can't this rich local club, bail out the Washington Freedom when they're on the verge of moving and so forth.
Yeah.
But,
this kind of hints at what I was trying to get to in the blog post that I wrote this year. The one that we wrote this year was the sixth in our kind of open soccer series. And the point was like, okay, well, we got the club is performing well on the field. We qualified for the Open Cup, which is a big milestone for us. And, we're approximately break even from a financial point of view. And so then it's like, well, now what? What do we do now? And, like the easy answer is like, well, we want the club to get better. We want to spin off and do, more things with youth in the community. We've talked about, wanting to do a women's team. But, if you really wanted to, like, think about investing in the club, this is where the whole argument around, like, well, where does the club go from here? Like, even if we were to be pro, what would we get from that, right? If we win the league, like if there was an incentive for us to win the league and we won the league and we went somewhere, like, then there's an incentive to invest. But, like, if you win the league, you just do the league over again the next year. And so, in the absence of some of the, merit-based promotion and relegation, mechanisms that a lot of people talk about, in the absence of those, there's not an incentive to invest in the club because there's nowhere to go, right? There's no ladder to climb. So we can get ourselves to, we can create a club from scratch. We can get it to break even. We can accomplish all sorts of great things in the community, and we can perform well on the field. But then, if it does get to the point where, okay, we need to invest to make it better, there's just not an incentive to do that.
Now we have the total number of teams in the NPSL. I tried to count recently and literally lost count as I was scrolling through tables and standings and so forth. I mean, it's over 100 now, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And there are the PDL is also pretty good size. UPSL has, I believe, 100 some now. So you do have, and of course, between various USASA leagues, that some of these clubs have been kicking around for 50 years.
Yeah.
You may have, let's say, 400 to 500, elite-ish amateur clubs. Some of whom, the NPSL, some of whom are legitimately semi-pro. You can't do that and have college players on the roster. That's the limiting factor there, in addition to, workers' comp and salaries and so forth. But what is preventing all of these organizations from getting together and forming that pyramid? I mean, it wouldn't lead up to MLS necessarily, at least not yet. But what is preventing everybody from getting together and forming something that would go up to Division III or even Division II, or call it what you like?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things, right? So there's we're kind of talking about different products in a sense, right? So there's some leagues that play a short season
in the summer,
which is a different product than, say, playing a full season. Like, you need a different set of players, you need a different set of opponents, because they're probably much closer geographically to keep the cost down.
Right.
Some leagues are open to traveling on overnight trips. Some leagues are open to only doing bus trips, right? And so I think a lot of it is just some of it's different, different projects and the coordination between them, and some of it is just not the lack of cooperation between the leagues. Why haven't all the UPSL teams and the NPSL teams gotten together and do one thing? Like, there's not an incentive to do it, first of all. And then there's two organizations, like two leagues, that are basically competing against one another, to be D4. And so, when you have this structure where the leagues are, the only way for a league to survive is to compete with the other league, like that's not a healthy structure for the pyramid. Right? Like, what should be happening is the teams should be competing with each other as for a chance to move up to another league, but that's not the system that we live in. And I think this kind of perpetual league against league thing, whether it is the NASL versus the MLS, the NASL versus the USL, the NPSL versus UPSL, this is the stuff that it gets in the way from having these things, I think, really come together. And there's one world in where you look at it and say, like, listen, it's U.S. Soccer's job to try to add some structure where there isn't some, and that they have not been helping these the leagues resolve some of these issues.
Now, there was the summit in Chattanooga. I've lost track of time. I forget when it was. March, maybe, or was it?
Sounds right.
Okay, and
before the season, a couple months ago.
Right, And so I know a lot of stakeholders got together to do that. Was there any response from people at U.S. Soccer on that? Did anyone at U.S. Soccer say, "Hey, we see what we're doing, what you're interested in doing. Let's try to talk about a framework"? Or have you gotten no response from Chicago?
As far as I know, as an individual, owner of a team and a board member of the NPSL, there hasn't been anything from the USSF or U.S. Soccer in general. I mean, there was representatives from USASA at that meeting, which I thought was great because they were able to answer some questions we had about how do all the leagues end up working together. But people expect the system to get fixed from the top down, and I just don't think that's ever going to happen because I don't think the top really cares about what's happening at the bottom. And I think I don't know if it's a lack of time or there's too much on the agenda or it's neglect, but you can't wait for the change to happen because I don't think there's any incentive coming from the top to kind of fix some of what's happening in the bottom.
Right. So it sounds like they're not actively trying to help you, but neither are they actively trying to stop you. Would that be accurate to say?
Well, I think that by not actively trying to help, I think that is actively trying, trying to keep things the same. Right? I think there's a lot of complaints about the professional league standards in general. Like, for example, whether it's the time zone requirements or the stadium size requirements or particularly the net worth requirements of the owners. I think some of those things are preventing clubs from making the moves that they would want to do. And so, one of the things that came out of that summit in Chattanooga was this idea of, hey, is there another structure that we can play in, one that, can contain a mix of amateur and pro teams and one that doesn't adhere to the professional league standards. And it's a really interesting idea. The big hurdle there is convincing fans and advertisers and sponsorship dollars that hey, products that don't have the D1 label on them are still interesting. And to be honest, I think that's a totally solvable problem, and I think that's mostly a marketing problem.
Right. There have been a few things along those lines of varying success. The one that sprung to my mind, and I wrote a story about it, was when WPS, Women's Professional Soccer, folded in early 2012. They joined with WPSL to form a stopgap, a bridge league, essentially. It was an 8-team league, a mix of pros and amateurs called WPSL Elite.
Yeah.
And if NWSL hadn't come in the next year, I think that would have continued. And also, USASA has the occasional sanctioned nominally professional league. I'm thinking in particular of the ASL,
yeah.
Which plays in the Northeast in our area, between. Maybe not as far up in New York, but definitely in the Mid-Atlantic, Baltimore or Philly, that sort of range. So I guess in that sense, you could start things through USASA, and the pro league standards wouldn't necessarily be an inhibiting factor at that point. Is that right?
Yeah, that's my understanding. The challenge is, I think the ASA has like 6 or 8, the ASL has 6 or 8 teams in it. It's like, how do you take something with the scale and the reach of the NPSL with 100 teams and make it, and maybe add, a dash of the ASL to it, where you have full professional rosters playing a longer season. And that's something that gets discussed a lot at the NPSL level. Like, okay, if we have the short season product that we have can never go away, right? Because that is like, that's how you start a club. That's how you test a market. That's how you see if your organization can operationally, is operationally up to the challenge of doing this.
Right.
But there needs to be a place for those successful NPSL teams to go, to see what's next, right? And I don't think the see what's next option needs to include, paying a multi-million-dollar expansion fee to get into another league. I think it should be like, okay, listen, let's just join another group of teams that wants to play a longer season with professional teams that has, and keep the travel cost relatively modest. Like, I think you need more stepping stones in that ladder there.
And these are all relatively non-controversial ideas that I think people have taken an interest in. You've been on Jason Davis's show at least a few times talking about things like this, and I think there are a lot of people who are. I think most people would be rooting for something like this to take effect. Now, you have also sort of grabbed onto the third rail of U.S. soccer, which is the more some of the more strident promotion relegation advocates, especially those who have ties to the NASL, like Ricardo Silva. You have the action with the Court of Arbitration for Sport still pending somewhere, and also you recently backed the action by Rocco Camiso to try to get a meeting together. What is there any reservation about that? What appeals to you about working with these people who are perhaps a little bit more difficult to work with?
Why do you say difficult to work with?
Well, Camiso in particular doesn't seem interested in hearing ideas that aren't his.
I think there's a bunch of different ways to interpret this. I think you could say that the U.S. soccer isn't particularly interested in hearing ideas that aren't theirs, right? I think the thing that frustrates me most is that you can whether you want to look at the FIFA statutes and agree that Article 9 says that merit-based promotion relegation is required or not. I mean, I know that's up for debate with a lot of people. It's like, listen, every other system except for Australia, every system in the world except for Australia, which is on its way to doing it, does it. The only system that doesn't. And, if you want to adhere to that and you want to advance and you want to, really say, like, okay, we're going to be one of the best soccer nations in the world and this is something that we're going to adopt, like some of the leadership at U.S. Soccer really just need to acknowledge it and put out a timeline and say, like, listen, okay, we're going to do this. This is how it's going to work. It's going to take us 10 years to get this. This is what's going to happen in year 2. This is going to happen in year 5. This is going to happen on year 7. Just, like, acknowledge it, put the plan together, and share the plan with the fans. But in the absence of that, it seems like mismanagement and neglect. And, I'm one of those folks that believe that, like, listen, there's, like, an underbelly of this culture that exists in that exists in the U.S. You've got all these clubs that are creating fans where they didn't exist, creating, players, and creating talent where maybe it didn't exist before. And they're doing a lot of the work to promote the sport and kind of, promote the culture of the game here in the U.S. And there's no path for them to move up because there's no one helping them to do so. And so, to me, it just feels it feels really frustrating from like an owner point of view as well as like a fan's point of view that there isn't this roadmap for how does the system come together. And in the absence of there being a roadmap, it just feels like no one's interested in solving that problem, which I think is one of the problems that needs to be addressed. I don't think I answered your original question, but
I suppose the question would be why line up behind Rocco Camiso or Ricardo Silva rather than, focus on what you guys are building, out of the Chattanooga Summit, which was,
Yeah. Well, I agree. I agree with both mechanisms. This is how Ricardo and I got together initially to begin with, right? So I've been an advocate of like, listen, the top is never going to make anything change. Start the revolution from the bottom. Start it with lower level soccer. Let's make a league with 1,000 teams that people care more about than the MLS. Like that I think is the alternative version of the pyramid that really changes things in the U.S. Now you can look at that and say that's realistic or not realistic or possible or impossible, but I think that's the way that it gets done. When I connected with Ricardo initially, he's like, that's a great plan, and I think we should all be doing that throughout the pyramid. But, there's also this approach of like trying to affect change from the top down, right? And I think, one example of trying to affect change from the top down was trying to get, alternative candidates into the presidency role, whether it was Eric or whether it was Kyle. These are folks that we thought were going to come in and kind of challenge the system and introduce new ideas. And, in the absence of that actually happening, like, we'll continue to do what we're doing from the bottom up, but I also think it's important to try to tweak and pull as many of the levers as you can, all throughout the pyramid, even if that means at the very, very top with challenging the FIFA statutes.
Now, one party that was not able to make much traction, and there was news on it just this morning, is NISA. And that's an unusual party in the sense that the person behind it, Peter Wilt, is someone who does have a ton of experience. He's built teams in MLS, in NASL, indoor soccer. I mean, he's seen just about everything there is to be seen. He was not at Chattanooga, and then the news today is that he's not going to be working with NISA anymore. Why do you feel that NISA wasn't able, with the experiences they could bring and the idea they had of being that Division III bridge between Division IV and the fourth tier and the second tier? Why is that struggle to gain traction?
There's a lot of reasons. I think that the easiest thing to point is it's like a chicken and egg game. I think with getting some of these leagues started. No one wants to commit until they realize how far they're going to have to travel and what the cost is, but you can't actually figure that out until you can get people to commit. And so it's kind of, it's like a sliding scale of who's in and who's not in. And in the absence of having, a set group of 12 teams that are definitely committed, it's really hard for teams to model out and plan. The second thing is, again, I think NISA was going to be be as part of D3 and adhere to the professional league standards. And I think there's some people that think like the professional league standards are a little bit outdated and maybe irrelevant in some ways, and maybe there's a better way to do this. And I think a lot of these ideas are evolving pretty quickly. And I first met Peter 2 years ago, I think before NISA was really a thing. And, to see how far it's come and then to see how far it's not come at the same time, these things move pretty quickly. A lot's happened in the last 2 years. And you could say that, there's so much that's happening now that it's really hard to design a product that's meant to last for a long term because there's been so much that's been changing. I think now that the election is out of the way and, we have a new U.S. soccer president for the next 4 years, there'll be, I think people can start strategizing a little bit more. But I think that was also adding to some of the instability in the thinking and the planning.
And we've mentioned the Pro League standards a couple of times, and one of the things I've heard is that and I'm not entirely sure how true this is, but I can look into it some more, but is that it's difficult to look into the Pro League standards while there are lawsuits concerning the Pro League standards. Is that your understanding too? Is there anything that can be done about the Pro League standards while they're subject to legal action?
I don't know. I didn't know that there was I know that there's lawsuits about the professional league standards, but I didn't know there was a group of people actively trying to change the professional league standards. I just assumed that those things were. I might sneeze in a second. But I just assumed that the professional league standards were mostly, set in stone and not changeable unless U.S. Soccer decided that they wanted to change them.
And so have you not been able to reach anyone at U.S. Soccer about changing the standards? Is there anything that, say, John Mata's on the board. Would he be someone who could, help, perhaps push to change the standards?
I think that's possible. I haven't talked to John specifically about this, but I bet you if you ask him, he might have some better answers than I do. I feel like I've been a little bit out of the loop on some of those discussions. If there was a way to do this, but my understanding is that there hasn't been a way, and it hasn't been a discussion that U.S. Soccer has been willing to have. I could be wrong on that, but that's just my understanding.
Yeah, it's hard to say because the standards were changing a good bit in the last decade, in part through the urging of the original NASL owners. And then they changed again in 2014. That was a little bit murkier, and then of course there was a suggested change in 2015 that failed.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. Now, in the process of getting these leads together, have you had any contact with USL?
I haven't. Like as an owner, as a team owner, the USL is a little out of our price range, right? Like we're not looking to pay a multi-million-dollar expansion fee to get into another league at the moment. As someone that's involved on the board of the NPSL, I haven't either. It's just not. It hasn't been a part of the NPSL's roadmap. I haven't had a need to reach out to some of those folks. I do know a handful of team owners that have had discussions with people at the USL. Wait, you think USL or UPSL?
USL.
USL. Okay, I want to make sure I heard that right. Yeah, I've
Right.
had a handful of discussions with owners that have thought about, hey, do we want to go USL or not? Those are folks that have been in the NPSL, and those are folks that aren't even in the NPSL, but not direct contact with the league.
Okay, because the reason I have they at least sound receptive to the idea of starting promotion relegation between Division 2 and Division 3, but then I don't know if they have any ideas for having a bridge between 3 and 4, which always seems to be the issue.
I don't think there's. I mean, what I anticipate happening is that the USL and the MLS will end up working together on some way to move clubs up and down between Division 1 and 2, and that could potentially satisfy the FIFA requirements if those end up being enforced. And so I think, my position on that has been, you got to tell fans to be careful what you wish for, right? So promotion between 1 and 2 is, sure, you can come up with a system of merit-based promotion, but it's certainly not an open system, right? And I think you got to really encourage fans that, like, if you're going to ask for something, you ask for an open system of promotion relegation, which means that you can start a club anywhere in the U.S. You can start one in Kingston in New York, and as long as you keep winning, you earn your right to play in bigger and better leagues without having to write a multi-million-dollar expansion fee, and then you can continue to invest and work your way up. And I think that's, that system that I just described right there is a lot different than there being a closed D1 and D2 system where teams move back and forth between them.
I guess I'd have to go back and find people who were in the Netherlands prior to about 10 years ago, or in England prior to 1990 or so, which was because they had a fairly rigid line between the pro and amateur ranks. In the Netherlands, I believe it was till about 5 years ago, they had 2 professional divisions, and then they had the amateur pyramid, and there was not much movement between the two. And then in England, there were there's a reason it's called non-league. It was You had the league of '92, and then the last place team was always subject to re-election. But what tended to happen was you'd have that team, and then you'd have 6 teams applying, and the leading vote getter would get in, usually beat that last place team. So I wonder if the intent all along was to eventually open that door, which in England has certainly happened. I know in the Netherlands there have been some reservations. I know there's some reservations about similar tiered systems elsewhere, but I've just wondered if there was a roadmap in place before that. That's something I don't know. That's the sort of thing that I think you'd have to find some pre-internet sources in England, or perhaps be able to read Dutch, which I cannot.
I also think it's easy to kind of draw a line, between the pyramid and say, well, these teams are amateur teams and they don't deserve to be promoted to pro teams. And I think that's a totally fair argument, right? And I think one of the challenges there is that, a lot of the amateur teams aren't even playing on the same schedule. They're playing a much shorter season. That's a totally fair argument to make. I think that, I think my larger point is that, like, if there was a system that enabled amateur teams to go professional, and then for those professional teams to compete for their way to move up in the pyramid, then you would see a lot more amateur clubs turning pro, right? In the absence of that system, amateur clubs will stay amateur. There's no reason for someone to invest in taking an amateur club from amateur to pro, because there's nowhere to go, unless, in addition to the fees for paying the pro roster, you also want to, lay out $3, $5, $10 million to buy your way into these leagues. And I think there's people in the U.S. that are just like, I'm just not going to make that investment. And there's certainly people outside of the U.S. that want to invest in soccer in the U.S. and they're not going to buy into an expansion fee model. It's it's unlike the systems that exist elsewhere in the world, and I think that's going to turn off foreign investors as well. But I think if you could create that incentive, and this is kind of what we've been saying all along with the merit-based promotion model, like if you could create that incentive, you would find people that would be willing to invest to take their amateur club pro, to get themselves into that pro system, and then to see how far they can take themselves within the pro system.
Now, one thing that I pitched as sort of a risk management idea would be that once you go pro, then as long as you keep meeting certain criteria, as long as you don't tear down your stadium, or as long as you don't shut down your youth academy or whatever, then you get to stay pro. And whether that's whatever the lowest tier of professional soccer is in the United States, you could not be relegated below that. Would that still meet with your concept of what an open system is all about?
I think the decision to be amateur or be pro is up to the owner, right? And I think this is one of the things I have a problem with, right? Like the next logical step for us as an NPSL club is probably to pay a couple $1 million and to get into USL, right? That's probably the only step forward at this point. We're not going to do that because, we're barely at break even. Like, we don't have the fan base to support it. Like, we just would not be able to make it work at the moment. But the problem is, let's say I was to make that step, and then I wanted to come back down because I couldn't compete at that level, then you lose your investment. You lose the investment that you've made in the expansion fee. My belief has been there's got to be another tier here where amateur teams can move up and play with a professional team. They can go from short season to long season. They can go from amateur squad to pro squad. And they can maybe even semi-pro, like not college guys, but there's some paid guys on the roster and some non-paid guys rosters. And then basically there's a system that allows you to feel out what level your club is comfortable operating in. Like you might be comfortable amateur short season, you might be comfortable amateur long season, you might be one of the few clubs that can make it professional club long season. And you have to be pretty transient about the way that you move people throughout those different products. Now, it's not promotion and relegation that allows people to do that. You can't just you can't take someone from a short season and promote them to a long season because they won the league, right? The team has to be ready to make that jump. You have to say, you know what, I have enough staff. I have enough room in my schedule. I have enough players that can play a long season. The club itself has to make that decision, and then it's got to be easy for them to move out of one league or one product and move into the second league or second product. And I think that's the thing that's missing. Once you find your way into that, and then you want to have merit-based promotion out of it, that's great, right? And if you want to say that, listen, the lowest that you can be promoted is to that bottom rung. We're not going to promote you to a short season. We're just going to promote you to that bottom. Or we're just going to relegate you to that, that bottom professional tier. I think that's totally fine. But I think you do need to acknowledge that, the transition between it's not just the transition between amateur and pro. It's the transition between short season and long season. That's also very difficult for clubs to make, and that has to be a choice by the ownership group, not necessarily a merit-based move.
So it sounds like that you still want clubs to be able to find their level, and so if you have a club that says, hey, it works for us to be a summer club where we sign college kids and they play 12 games, then so be it.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I mean that's the model that the NPSL uses, and I think that model's great. But I also think that the NPSL's job should be hey, to keep that system working very well, because that's where new teams, new players, new talents, new markets, that's where they come from. And then for the one team every year that is a breakout success, that team that club has a path forward. So if they want to, grow, if they want to expand, they can do so in a way that they don't have to pay, a huge expansion fee, and they can do it in a way that they don't have to sell a big percentage of their club to an investor to meet the minimum net worth requirements.
In a lot of countries, when we talk about a pyramid, it's really more like a ladder. I mean, in England, you have 5 national tiers, 20 teams, and then 22, 22, 22, and I forget how many are in the conference, if it's 22 or 24. would you be more willing to have an actual pyramid where, say, the third tier might be a lot, or third or fourth tier might be a lot of regional leagues that feed into maybe 2 Division Twos and 1 National Division One?
Yeah, I mean that's the way the English pyramid works. If you get far enough around, what is it, level 5 or level 6, where it starts to tier itself out regionally.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the great things about the NPSL. Like, I don't have to get my squad on a plane and go travel to play someone in California. Like, all of our matches are bus trips. You know, we have a match this weekend. We have to travel, to the northeast corner of Massachusetts. It's our longest trip. It's a 5-hour trip, but it's a trip you can take on bus. It allows us to keep the travel expenses low. And so, in a country that's as large as the U.S., like, the only way to do this is to make it work on a regional level. And I think that's what people want to sign up for. I mean, people sign up for the NPSL because with 100 teams, like, it's super regional, right? Like, if we talk about doing something with a longer season, like, sure, will there be extra travel? Yeah, that'd be interesting. Like, I would travel to Virginia every now and then in order to play a match in a longer season league, right? But I don't want all my matches to be on the West Coast. I don't want all of them to have to. I don't want to be traveling to Texas and the Midwest every single weekend. It's just too expensive at this particular level. And so, I think that as we start to think about what are the next products that need to exist, like at the lowest levels, so that these clubs can start to grow and start to advance, like you certainly have to think of them as regional products.
Now, on those lines, the NPSL, same as the PDL and the UPSL, they do have national playoffs. And I know last year one of the finalists had trouble putting together a team because it had run late, it had run into August, and a lot of the players had to go back to their college teams. Would there ever be any consideration saying, look, we'll have, a cup competition that maybe we'll play on, Wednesday nights like the U.S. Open Cup, but we'll run regular season regional games as long as we can and not have a national playoff system, not have national playoffs, not, cut off some teams July 15th because they didn't make the playoffs, and then have other teams not be able to finish out the season because they're in the final.
Yeah, I suppose, like, if you look at it, the NPSL season is 10 weeks, and the playoffs are another, is it 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 weeks? I mean, it's a big chunk of the summer. But I think in the absence of any other way to reward teams, like in the absence of any type of like promotion or relegation and a way to like push teams up, is a playoff system. It's like, okay, we got to figure out who the best team in the country is, so that we, at the end of that, we can do this all again. And I think that's kind of expected with the National League anyway, right? It's like, okay, we've got a whole bunch of teams competing. Let's find out which is the best team in the league. If there was a system where we were playing a much longer season and each of the regional winners were being promoted into another conference where they would then play each other the next season, that's a totally different idea. But the travel expenses would be higher for that league, right? You would need those those clubs to be okay with those travel expenses. So you get yourself into that kind of issue again, where can you set up a merit-based system where people get promoted where they can't afford to pay for the travel fees for that enhanced league, right? So it's kind of a tricky thing to resolve.
So we've talked a lot about possible future pyramids and so forth. Let's close with something fun from the present, which is that your club met one of its goals ahead of schedule, which was to get into the Open Cup, this grand old tournament. So to close off, can you just describe what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, I mean, we set a club goal, like right even before the club had a name, before we were Stockade FC. We said, let's make a club and let's try to, the goal will be to qualify for the U.S. Open Cup in 5 years, right? And, when you put that down on paper, that seems like an almost impossible thing to do. And with the run that we made last year, we had a really strong team last year. We did, we won our conference in the NPSL. That allowed us to qualify for the U.S. Open Cup. We had our first match it was last week. We played the Long Island Rough Riders of the PDL. It was in Long Island, so it was a tough 3.5 hour commute. from Kingston for the guys. It was a Wednesday, so it was really tough to get fans out there. But hey, we played. We did not win. We lost. We were 2-2 tied going into extra time, and then the wheels kind of fell off the bus, and we ended up losing 6-3. So it was a real heartbreaker to get knocked out of the tournament early. But I think once you're in it, all you want to do is get back. And so I think that's the goal for this season. And a lot of the guys are really fired up about, all right, let's play this season really well. Let's have a real good showing in NPSL 2018, and let's see if we can get ourselves back to the 2019 Open Cup.
All right, sounds like a one of many interesting goals that you've set, and best of luck with that. Thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks. I should give a shameless promotion for our own club. If you want to learn more, you can go to stockadefc.com or at Stockade on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and learn about our upcoming matches. You can read the manifestos we've been writing, and we also have a fantastic online shop where everything you purchase goes directly towards club expenses.
And game broadcasting, right?
And streaming. Actually, everything that we do is all financed by, merchandise, sponsorships, and ticket sales. So every time someone buys a T-shirt, it goes directly to, helping us get a little bit closer to break even.
And who's your commentary team now?
We have two local guys, Spike and Patch, both from up here in the Hudson Valley. And so we're streaming to YouTube this season. Last year we did Facebook. This year we're doing YouTube. And we have our first away game this Saturday in Massachusetts. So we're going to, I actually might be doing the play-by-play with my dad. You never know, right? That's how it works in the lower levels. But we shall see. It's always fun, and it's always fun to try to figure out a lot of these problems.
All right. Well, that's excellent, and thanks again.
Great. Thanks for having me on the show. Appreciate it.
There you have it, more on pro soccer. It's been kind of a pro soccer week rather than a youth soccer week. Perhaps that's because both my youth soccer practices were rained out, and don't want to hear from the shoeless soccer people because during one of those practices that I canceled, we had a tornado warning. So, anyway, we'll get back to youth soccer next week. Check out RandySoccerDad.com. Hands on.